Welcome back. I'm Gary Parr.
And I'm Beth Ellicott.
And you are listening to Fiber Talk, the twice weekly podcast for needlework artists. Our artist this week, author of a book that has sucked Beth and me in. The book is The Fabric of Civilization, Virginia Postrel. Virginia, welcome.
It's great to be with you.
Oh, this is going to be fun. Now, Virginia is the answer to the question that many parents who are paying for college have asked, and that is, how are you ever going to make a living with a degree in English Lit and an emphasis in Renaissance? Yes.
Yeah, that is true. Well, of course, that I graduated from college in 1982, and I did not see my college degree as the way I was going to make a living. I worked on the school paper, and that was kind of my professional training. And then the other thing is I had a backup skill that I knew I could always pay my rent because I'm a really good typist.
Oh, okay.
Which just goes to show you how your backup skill can disappear along pretty much with your front skill too.
Yep.
I don't recommend that people go into journalism these days.
No, as a magazine editor, I tell people don't. Yeah. It's a tough world. Yeah, it definitely is. Yeah.
But back then, it was a great thing to do if you were curious about the world and you wanted to study English literature as an undergraduate and you didn't want to be a lawyer. And I also took lots of economics. I took economics every term, and that has stood me in good stead professionally, but not the way people might think. I mean, it's just a really good way of understanding the world, asking good questions. And I did start my career as a business journalist, so it was helpful there as well.
Okay, you're the first one other than an economist who that's really paid off for, because I had to take a couple of those courses because mine was biology and chemistry, and I had to take a couple of those. And it's like, well, I don't know what world you guys are operating in, but get me out of it. So...
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily take the first time.
It didn't take the second time with me.
You were just interested in economy because my brother describes it as the dismal science.
Well, that's what it's called sometimes. But yes, I was. I grew up, I was a teenager in the 1970s, and the economy was not good, and there were lots of things I wanted to understand more about what was going on, although the truth is macroeconomics never appealed to me. But price theory and how markets work and economic history in particular, which there's a lot of in this book, did really appeal to me.
When you headed to Princeton, what did you have in mind? Because I don't think any of us ever end up doing what we start out to do. Did you have a direction? Have you ended up there, or did you do a 90-degree turn somewhere?
I did not have a specific career in mind. I figured that out while I was in college. I thought that I would major in history rather than literature, but it turns out that my South Carolina public school had provided me with an abysmal background for becoming a history major. And in retrospect, this is really more a matter of character than preparation. If I'd been willing to put in the work, I could have done it. But I took my first history class. My first history professor was not especially inspiring, to say the least. My first English professor was amazing. It was a Shakespeare class. I actually had not a sophisticated preparation in English, but I had read a ton of literature as part of my high school curriculum and on my own. And so there I was more comfortable with it. And it also, the way I did it, it gave me a way to study a lot of the ideas I was interested in the Renaissance period. And so I kind of went forward that way. But I didn't have a career in mind. That came from thinking about this question of, if you're an English major and you don't want to be a lawyer, what can you be?
Right, yeah.
And of course, there are lots of business things you can do with an English major too. You might have to eventually get an MBA, but if you have those kinds of skills, there are things that companies need. But there were things that I didn't know about back then, primarily in the world of marketing, not PR, but actual marketing that might have interested me. But anyway, it's been a good life. But to go back to your question, did you know what you wanted to do? I went to Princeton, but one of the places I applied to was Davidson in North Carolina, which was where my father had gone. And in that interview, they asked me some question like, what do you want out of life? I forget exactly what it was. And there were three, and off the top of my head, I gave this answer, which I'm pretty amazed. I'm pretty impressed with my 18-year-old self. But I said three things. I want to love and be loved. I want to do something that leaves a lasting mark. And I want to never stop learning. And that has been my life, so I can't complain.
No.
Oh.
Now that last one though is the key. Never stop learning. Oh, yeah. That's the key.
I think we had an aunt who just recently passed, and she was 100 years old, and I think that's what kept her young. She was always very curious about the world around her, and I found that inspiring. Always wanting to learn something new.
Yeah. I have a wonderful friend in New York named Joan Crone, who, I always have to do the math, is 93. She became a journalist when she was 40. She made her first movie it came out when she was 89, and now she's making her second one.
Oh my!
And she's of that persuasion. I mean, obviously there are certain things that make that easier for people health-wise, and she's financially well situated and things like that. But still, it's an inspiring example, as is your aunt.
Right.
Now. The Fabric of Civilization is your third book, but you also have a nice little list of being a regular contributor in the Atlantic, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Bloomberg. Those are one of those is Lofty, and you've collected a bunch of them. Did your writing start out the usual freelance route?
No, it did not. Actually, one correction, it's my fourth book, but there's only so much space on the cover.
Okay.
I wrote a book that my first book was called The Future and Its Enemies, and it came out in 1998. Actually, I was very fortunate. Between my junior and senior years, I got an internship in the long defunct now Philadelphia bureau of the Wall Street Journal. And back in those days, the journal still hired a lot of its interns for full-time work afterwards. And the idea was basically you stay there till you retired. And that changed, that whole model changed probably within about 5 years of my graduation. And they started hiring, much more experienced people rather than people right out of school. But I did start my career at the Wall Street Journal's Philadelphia bureau and worked there for a couple of years, moved to Boston where my now husband was in graduate school, and worked for Inc. magazine for a couple of years there, and then moved out to the West Coast, LA, with him, and went to work for Reason magazine, which is a libertarian political magazine that I had always been interested in, and stayed there. Eventually became the editor-in-chief, was the editor through the 90s, and then went off to be a freelancer. And because I said it's great defending free society, but I want to understand how free societies work and what people do with their freedom and how they discover things. And, that I didn't want to, I continued to comment on politics. I still can do, although less and less. But it was not the only thing I wanted to do. And I was also, much as I adored being a manager and had a fantastic staff, I was tired of being responsible for other people and budgets and all that stuff. And it was
just a moment. Thank you.
Oh,
yes.
That's so funny because my daughter's, she's thinking about taking over the creative editorship of her school's publication. And she goes, but that means I have to manage people. And I'm like, yeah.
I actually really enjoyed managing people. And as I say, I did have a wonderful staff and very dedicated, smart, interesting people. I mean, every management job has its downside, but as they go, this was a pretty good one. But after 10 years, it was just, I was ready to do something else. Anyway, so that's my career.
Yeah. No, that's the whole thing. When I was part of a startup magazine, and we were doing 6 times a year, and it was just me.
Oh.
And I'd been chief editor of 2 magazines prior with full-blown staff written magazines, full-blown everything, And it was like, oh, this is heaven. I just sit in my office. I don't have to have meetings. It's just great. And then the second year, the publisher came along. We're going to 9 times. I said, no. I said, now we got to hire somebody, and yeah, I know that feeling. And now the magazine that we do now, it's just me and my wife, and it's, no people to manage. It's heaven. Yeah. And I'm with you. I don't mind managing people.
It was less the people managing that I disliked than the money managing, actually. We
yeah.
were very poor. And so it was always a struggle. It was a nonprofit, and, it was difficult. We were very ambitious, but we were very poor. So it was kind of like it had a lot of the characteristics of a startup in terms of the work hours and such. But not necessarily, depending on how your startup is capitalized, not necessarily some of the money.
Right. Yeah. Everything you want to do, how can we do it for free? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I became very good at motivating people to do stuff for very little, which serves me well as the program director of my weaving guild.
Yeah. So you get to, you're writing these books, but we're going to lose time here. So let's get to Fabric of Civilization. You have weaving and dyeing that you're doing. Is that something that came after the book, or was that your side hustle interest while you're writing books?
No, weaving and dyeing definitely came because of the book.
Okay.
And I learned to weave because early in the research, I decided I was never going to understand looms unless I took some weaving lessons, because I'm a little challenged once you add that third dimension. So that came out of book research, and I really liked it, even though it was difficult because challenged in the third dimension. But I liked it, and I liked the weavers I met, and I got very involved in that. Dyeing, I like dyeing, but I don't consider myself a dyer. I don't really have the facilities for it. I've done it in workshops. I've done made some videos about dyeing I did in my kitchen, but I have a small kitchen. So I don't, I'm not into it in a big way. For me, previous to working on the book, in my teenage years, I sewed, and I made costumes for school plays as well as making my own clothes. I was never a particularly great seamstress, but I did it. And I did a lot of count and cross stitch. I did, when I got married, I made my chuppah, the Jewish wedding canopy. I made designs with count and cross stitch stitch and an applique of a tree of life in the middle. So my husband called it the Girl Scout wedding. But anyway, so getting ready for Girl Scout wedding. Anyway, I did some Bargello a little, but I was never, I'm not like your audience in the sense that this was never the thing I did all the time. I would get into it for a while, and then I would exhaust the number of things I had ideas to make and stop.
Well, you need to spend some time with Beth and me. We can fix you up on the exhausting of ideas. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So what part do you dye? Do you eco dye? Are you doing synthetic dyeing, or just whatever the workshop happens to
Well,
be?
the dyeing that I have done, again, I would put it under the category of research. I've done indigo dyeing in a couple of workshops in LA, which was invaluable in helping me understand how that works, because I had read a ton about it, and I was actually working on the dye chapter of the Fabric of Civilization, and I thought, LA is a big city. There must be somebody here who runs indigo dyeing workshops, because I am just beating my head against this to understand it. And there's a guy named Graham Keegan who does fantastic workshops and taking that workshop cleared things up a lot for me. I also traveled to India to do research for the book, and that trip was very focused on dyeing and printing, both going to modern factories and taking a workshop on traditional block print with a little bit, because I was officially enrolled in a workshop on block printing, and there was another woman there from Britain who was officially enrolled in a workshop on Bandhani, which is sort of like shibori, if you know what that is. But because there were only two of us and only two teachers, we kind of each did both. And there we dyed with a number of different dyes. We dyed with indigo, we dyed with madder and lock, and I don't remember. It was like about 10 different dyes, mostly botanical dyes. And then I've made videos on dyeing with avocados and dyeing with cochineal. So those were the avocados was just because I had heard about this thing, and I thought, I eat a lot of avocados. Let me do something with these pits. And so I did an experiment with that. And then the cochineal, I had made a video on the history of cochineal, which you can see on my YouTube channel. But then I thought I should follow it up with one where I actually show how the process works. And so I did dyeing there with both cultivated cochineal that I bought on Etsy and wild cochineal, which is really a pest. It's not exactly the same as the cochineal that's raised for dye that I collected from the Beverly Hills Cactus Garden.
There we go.
Which collecting cochineal in the Beverly Hills Cactus Garden sometimes requires sweet talking the authorities who wonder what the heck you're doing.
Yeah. Now we should establish this book, because when got to talk to Virginia, because this looks interesting, and a book titled "The Fabric of Civilization" just suggests to me at the outset just a bunch of stories and some history about fabrics, and so that was what I was expecting when I sat down to read it. But it isn't that at all. And you have so enlightened me, and I'm sure the same for Beth, the importance of thread and fabric and how it has driven history and driven civilization really from the beginning of man. And so what's the catalyst that sends you down that path rather than just telling a bunch of stories about how cotton's made?
Well, what was interesting to me was that it was realizing that the history of textiles was the history of technology, it was the history of economics, it was the history of cultural exchange and trade, warfare, exploration. It was basically a way into looking at human history. And then the challenge became, how do you organize such a thing? I mean, because I want to write a book. I want to write a book that regular busy people can read. I don't want to write a library. I don't want to write an academic tome. They're wonderful stories, but I also want it to be sort of intellectually rigorous, because part of what attracted me was hearing a number of academic scholars give talks on specific topics, like the export of Brazil wood dyestuffs from the Spanish colonies, or the French ban on printed cotton, where they treated it for 73 years the way we treat cocaine. These kinds of stories were great, but I needed some way to make it coherent and also to tell the thematic stories that I wanted to tell. And so what I came up with was a sort of woven structure where each chapter has a stage in the textile journey. You start with fiber, you move to thread, then cloth, then dye. Then there's a chapter on traders, the merchants who sell the cloth, and consumers, the people who use the cloth, whether they buy it in the marketplace or obtain it in some other way. And then finally, a chapter about some of the things that are going on today with innovations in textiles. So that gives you part of the outline, but then how do you decide what goes in or out? Because the history of fiber is huge. The history of dyes is huge. All of these things could easily be a book in themselves. And so there I have the other part of the sort of, if the stage in the journey is the warp, the theme of the chapter is the weft. So the theme of the chapter on fiber is about how even the fibers we think of as natural are products of human ingenuity. They're really artificial in that sense. The one on thread is about the enormous effort it takes to make thread and the enormous amounts of thread it takes to weave anything or knit anything, and therefore why that led to mechanical innovation and ultimately to the Industrial Revolution. The one on dyes is on the history of chemistry. The one on cloth is on math and algorithms. The one on trade, not surprisingly, is on economics, but it's more specifically it's on what I call social technologies. That is, things that people invent to be able to work with each other, especially to do things with strangers or across distances. And this includes everything from written correspondence and literacy to all those arithmetic techniques that you learned in elementary school, Arabic, the spread of Arabic numbers, to various kinds of financial instruments. And so this, and then the one about consumers is about how textile consumers want what they want, and they will go to amazing lengths to get it. So some of which are quite nasty, but others of which, you just have to marvel at them. So it was this wonderful experience of learning all about what human beings have done all around the world to get the cloth that they need and want. So, for example, you mentioned thread. All around the world, people developed first, going back to literally Neanderthals, the idea that you could twist plant fibers and make string. And once you have string, suddenly a whole bunch of other things become possible. You can make fishing nets. You can make baby carriers. You can make traps. You can, for catching small animals, you can tie the stone tools that we can still find can be tied to wooden shafts, so that what we call the Stone Age could be called the String Age. It's just that we don't have very much. You have to look really hard to find the string.
Right. Well, that particular one stuck with me because I think somewhere I read if you find his prehistoric or old stonework that has had string wrapped on it, don't clean it because the fiber residue is valuable. And it just set me to thinking museums all over the world, how much information about textiles has been lost because the first thing they did was scrub the dirt off.
Yeah, a lot. Yes, that is absolutely true. And especially about textiles as opposed to string, because there are only a very few places in the world where actual cloth survives the ages. They tend to be very dry climates. There are places in Peru, there are places in northwest China, there are places in the Middle East that are very dry where ancient textiles have been found, and there are some bogs in Europe where they're anaerobic environments where the textiles have been preserved. But basically, cloth rots. So the earliest indications of textiles, the reason we can say it goes back like 11,000 years, are imprints. They're either imprints on what were ceramic clay vessels that were wrapped before they were necessarily completely dry, or there are places where there's been mineralization where the textiles have disappeared, but mineral deposits have been left and you can see the weave or the textile structure. And it used to be that archaeologists would clean these off. And they don't anymore. They're very careful now. But that is something that has happened really just in the last few decades, that people have become acutely aware of the value of preserving these indicators of early cloth use.
Yeah, that one really stuck with me. How much has been thrown away that we would know. Yeah. Yep. The other thing was thread. Now, I'm sitting here surrounded by more thread than I deserve. I'm really sloppy about it. Cutting off, probably should stitch 3 more stitches before I throw the thread away. And we really think nothing of it. But throughout history, thread has, especially early, thread has been the choke point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The one thing that we take for granted, we don't even think about, is how much thread there is even in relatively small common things. So the example I use most often in the book is that to weave the denim it takes to make a pair of jeans takes about 6 miles of thread. And before the Industrial Revolution, the fastest spinners, best spinners in the world, who were Indians using the charka, would have taken around 100 hours. A spinner would have taken around 100 hours to make enough thread for one pair of jeans or trousers. Another example is a bandana, which is even smaller, and I have a video on bandanas. 22 inches square. It has about 1.5 miles of thread in it. So, and then those of us who do any kind of, fiber arts kinds of, whether you sew or you embroider or you knit or you weave, crochet, all of those things, we use yarn and we pay for it, and it's an expense. But if you really screw up, you can get rid of it.
Right. Yeah.
And as you say, maybe you should take 3 more stitches, but you don't. And this is a luxury. This is a luxury that we really enjoy, that started in the late 18th century. So it's a luxury that's about 250 years old. And that changed everything, because making the thread, it was so time consuming that weavers didn't always have all the thread that they needed just to make the cloth. And then you go to things like making something you wouldn't have, like quilting, for example, is ancient. The idea of a piece of cloth with something in between and another piece of cloth and sewn together. But patchwork quilts of the kind that we think of today when we hear the term quilt are a relatively new invention. They are a product of the abundance of cloth, where you can waste little scraps. First of all, you can waste them making tailored clothing, which used to be something that only very rich people had. And in most parts of the world, even rich people didn't have it. Everything was made in rectangles. Think of a kimono or a sarong or a toga, or, this was a tip of sari. Everything's made in rectangles because that conserves all the cloth. When you start to have abundant cloth, many more people wear tailored clothing that produces scraps that can then be recycled into quilts. And you also start to get cloth cut up specifically for the purpose of making quilts. I mean, maybe it's from old clothes or whatever, but you don't use every inch of it. You make little rectangles, or you make a log cabin design, or you make little triangles or hexagons or whatever. And this really just goes back to the 19th century. There's a letter from Jane Austen asking her sister to send her some more cloth scraps for making quilts. So there started to be a market in these. But that is something that is relatively recent.
Yeah, that was one of the other things that struck me. One of the people I follow on Instagram, I don't know, I think Beth does too, is Isabella Pitcher. And she makes historic clothing, gorgeous, amazing stuff.
Yeah.
And she'll do videos about how you would dress an Elizabethan woman, with all the stuff that goes underneath it. And it's fascinating, just the mechanics and structure of it. But the one thing I've learned from her is how all of that is aimed at protecting the outer garment, because the dress, the skirt, all of that is made to be used forever and handed down. And so you protect that with undergarments that keep sweat and away from it. And so when I read your book, then it's how important fabric is, just as you described, and make things in rectangles so we don't waste a piece. And because today we just don't think anything of it. T-shirt gets a hole in it, pitch it.
Yep. Although there is an entire rag industry that recycles cloth into rags. My friend Adam Minter has a great book called Secondhand that is all about secondhand stuff, including clothing. I learned about the rag industry from that. We have this abundant fabric, yeah.
And again, there's a whole restarting of that, of saving these things, of the visible mending movement.
Right. Yeah.
And thrifting. I'm surprised most of my daughter's friends, that's how they get their clothes, is by thrifting.
Well, one product of this amazing textile abundance that we have, and especially in recent years, is that the stuff you can find in a thrift store is quite amazing. I started going to thrift stores to buy things to use making videos, and then I was like, whoa, look at this stuff. I think I'll buy some blouses. So, you can get some really nice stuff in a thrift store these days.
Yes. But it shows our abundance. We're so used to that in this modern day and age, to have this abundance of cloth. And your book really opened my eyes to that. And I knew that cloth was hard to make, but I didn't realize how recently that changed.
Yes.
And all of a sudden there was an abundance of it.
Yeah, it really you get the confluence of things really in the 19th century. So it starts in the late 18th century with the spinning machines that give rise to the Industrial Revolution. And of course, like every new technology, it's not as efficient at the beginning as it gets eventually. And then about a generation later, you get the power looms. In the mid 19th century, you get synthetic dyes, and that open up a whole bunch of different color possibilities. And and things proceed along. And there are other things going on. After Japan opens up in the mid 19th century, Japanese silk growers who were quite sophisticated already, but they take their traditional knowledge and combine it with scientific, the science of the day, what was understood about genetics. Obviously, they didn't understand about DNA in the 19th century, but they understood about hybrids and stuff. And they take this and they develop new hybrid silkworms that produce silk that works really well with the American power looms. And Japan and the U.S. become the great silk producers of the 19th century and make silk into something where, a typical woman, certainly middle-class women and even shop girls and stuff, will own a silk dress or possibly even more than one. And so it's not something that only the rich have. And one thing I noticed, and this is something I've just noticed going to museums, it's not something I researched, is that when you look at crazy quilts from that period, they're often made of silk. And I think that is because while you were making tailored dresses out of silk, it was still way too precious to cut up into perfect triangles or whatever.
Yeah.
So you have to adapt and use the embroidery stitches to embellish it and all that sort of thing. So yeah, it's a really interesting story about how technology and trade and all these things can produce changes in society and in the everyday way that people live, so that now we live in a world where we're surrounded by textiles and we don't even think about where they came from.
Yeah. The trade, you mentioned trade, the chapter on trade, I'm going to go reread it because it's you have no idea the time that was involved in trade, the trust that what you shipped by boat that would take months would actually get there and get to the person that was supposed to, that your money would come back to you. What an incredible, loose, weak chain of faith in your fellow man just to do some basic transactions.
Yeah, no, it's quite amazing. And of course, there are things I didn't get into, like a lot of these trade networks were ethnic networks or they were familial networks. There were things in them other than complete strangers, but at some point you are trusting strangers. And the question is, how do you do that? And what do you need to do that? And even how do you communicate? So even if everyone has goodwill and nobody's trying to do rip somebody off or anything like that, but how do you make what you want clear? And this is not just before the internet, it's
right.
Before the telegraph. We're talking about written communications over long distances. So one thing I start that chapter with, one of the things I was just amazed to hear about are these, there are tens of thousands of clay tablets that are about 4,000 years old that have been found in a site that is in what is now Turkey. It was a city called Kanesh, where there were sort of expat traders from a city called Assur that is near where Mosul is now in Iraq. And so it's about 900 miles. And these traders, Assur was the place of middlemen. So people would bring cloth to Assur. They would also bring sheep that were then plucked. They didn't shear then, plucked, and the local women would spin it and they would weave their own cloth. And then men from Assur would take caravans to Kanesh where they would trade. And so there are these what's been found in Turkey are these 4,000-year-old letters, mostly some contracts, often from the wives who were literate, telling them, here I'm sending this textile with this guy and these textiles with this other guy, and you should expect them. And And sometimes there would be instructions, sell it right away and send me back the money because I need the money right away. Other people would say, listen, I want you to get the best price. And so the guy in Kanesh would have agents who would go out to the towns, and there would be a debt contract there, and all of this had to be worked out, and it's 4,000 years old. And what's so interesting about it is, while these people could not be more different from people today, there's certain things that remain the same, and some of them are business things, like how do you know that the sales rep who is an independent agent who's selling your stuff on credit is going to come back and pay his debt, and give, once he sells it, he's going to pay the debt that he owes you. And other things are sort of a combination of familial and business partner, like the wife who writes and says, why do you keep complaining about the cloth that I send you? I'm sending you good cloth. And it seems to me, my reading of it is that aside from the tension between husband and wife, it's like the manufacturer who's saying, why don't you sell what I can make? And the sales guy who's saying, why don't you make what I can sell? And this is the eternal inside guy and outside guy thing that happens all the time in business. So there are, as you say, it's amazing people working out not just technologies in the sense of machines or even things like dyes, but also social technologies, institutions, ways of dealing with other people, even people that you don't necessarily know all that well.
Yeah, that one really opened my eyes to obviously the economics of it, but to just do business like that, and the time. We're so used to instant, but the time, I sent this stuff months ago. Where's my money?
Yeah. Yeah. And I didn't get into this, but the interest rates were quite high by today's standards. And that's partly because the risk and the time and everything were greater than they are today. There's information, all those things that make things riskier. You charge higher interest on these loans than anybody would even consider today.
Yeah. To do a book like this obviously takes a lot of research. I mean, you're covering civilization from the beginning of man to today. What is that like? Is it a lot of travel, or is it just a lot of library and internet time?
Yes. It's
okay.
all of the
Figured that.
So one of the things that I have found in my work that is very useful, especially when you're getting into a field that's relatively new to you, is to attend academic conferences. And one of the things that got this kicked off before there was a book, there was an article, was going to the Textile Society of America conference in 2014, which was in UCLA, which is near where I live, and hearing papers on textile archaeology, on textiles in the 18th century, some of these history papers, and thinking, wow, this is really interesting. And also meeting people who were doing that work, which then led to other contacts, which then led to other contacts. So there's a lot of that, and that is one kind of travel, is going to places where you can meet a lot of people in one place. So literally, I went to China for this purpose. Well, that's a long way to go to a conference at the China National Silk Museum. But if it saves you trips to 6 other countries,
Yep.
it can be worth it and gets you. I mean, that's where I learned about how Kente Cloth is made. It was actually in China. I someday hope to go to Ghana, but that was not feasible for this book. So there was that kind of travel. Then there was also travel, like I mentioned, I went to India, where I had a kind of specific research in mind. I was farther along in the book. I wanted to observe things. So, India is the sort of exotic part. I also went to Jefferson, Georgia, which is about an hour north of Atlanta to visit a contemporary spinning mill. So I went, it's not in the book, but I went to Lubbock, Texas to see a cotton harvest. So I did travel not just to far-flung locales. I went right in my backyard to not only take in LA, not only to take a dye workshop, but I also went to a contemporary dye plant there. And I was amazed to see that you could do this in LA, which is a very expensive place to operate any kind of factory and has very strict environmental regulations. But this was quite inspiring. And I visited MIT and Carnegie Mellon, places where people are doing cutting edge research on textiles. So there was a lot of travel. There was a lot of library research. I'm very fortunate to have access to a bunch of really good research libraries. So, and of course the internet. I don't know how possible it would be even to do something like this without the access to, or it would certainly take a lot longer without the access to the things that are available online. Although, had I not finished it before everything shut down for COVID, it could not have been done only using the internet. It did require travel, and it did require access to the insides of libraries.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
This what is that? Beth, you were asking me about or mentioned about that Kente cloth or what? I missed that one, so now I need to be enlightened.
So Kente cloth is a specific type of cloth that developed in probably in the last couple hundred years in West Africa. Its origins are greatly disputed. You could get in a big fight in Ghana about who invented it, but it is. You often see people wearing it or cloth reference it at Black Americans at college graduations, for example, will have a stole which has these bright, usually red, green, and yellow designs. That is a Kente cloth stole, although technically what Kente cloth is a big piece of cloth which is made up of strips which are woven 4 to 6 inches wide on a special loom that weaves alternating bands of warp face and weft face patterns. It's very complicated to design a piece of Kente cloth because you have to do this alternating pattern on the strip, and then you have to think about you're going to sew these strips together into a single cloth that then for a man would be worn like a Roman toga. And you want to think about how it's going to look on the body, and you also want to think about how the strips are going to sew together. So it's a really interesting, really demanding type of weaving, and its meaning has changed over time because it started as the sort of exclusive use of people who were around the sort of essentially aristocrats or royalty among the Asante, which is one of the groups in West Africa. I'm leaving out another group called the Ewe, who also have a claim to having invented Kente cloth. It's my take, based on research by somebody who studied it, is that this is a merger of their two textile traditions. But it started as this very exclusive type of cloth. And then in the mid-20th century was adopted by the first president of Ghana as a sort of symbol of Pan-African identity. And then it came to be adopted worldwide in the African diaspora as a sort of symbol of African pride and that's how you end up starting in, I can't remember if it's the 70s or 80s, but you start to have college graduates wearing these stoles, and it's had this really interesting shift in meanings over time. where it has, and it's very important in African American culture. The patterns, I say the patterns, not necessarily Kente cloth. It's per se, because a lot of what you'll see if you go online, especially if you go on, say, Etsy, and you Google and you put, you're looking for Kente cloth, you will find actual Kente cloth. You will also find people using the patterns and using printed cloth, just plain cotton weave that's been printed in various ways to make things that reference Kente cloth. So what exactly it is has changed over time.
Mm. Okay. Now, see, I learned something. That's good. That's
more
good.
than you want to know. But
no. Actually, no. That
interesting kind of cloth, and I analogize the structure of my book to Kente cloth, because it's not only that each chapter has the weft and warp and weft, but it's also that the book itself is like these strips that have been sewn together into a whole.
Yeah. No, I don't think you can give me too much information. Not possible. Beth, you've been pounding through the book today. What stood out for you?
Well, and it's something that Gary and I discussed one point in time was the use of textiles and repurposing them.
Yes.
Someone had said, "Oh, that's a bad thing to take Grandma's quilt and to make it into a project bed." She didn't like that, and but reading your book makes me think, we've been doing this throughout history.
Yeah. Yeah, when you say you can't do that, it's because you have so much cloth that you can say, oh, maybe I wouldn't use that. And I actually have some wonderful things that I've bought in various places that are repurposed, particularly from Guatemala, where people traditionally women wear skirts that are woven on a floor loom. They have they tend to have a kind of vertical look in the stripes in the pattern. They often are, sometimes they're ikat, and they wear these blouses called huipil, which have usually woven in, but it looks like embroidery. They have patterns and decorative. And I have a purse that I bought that combines fabric from the skirt as the bottom of the purse and fabric from the blouse as sort of a band around the top, and then some more skirt pattern for fabric for the handles, because things wear out if they're actually worn, and then what are you going to do with them? And one thing you can do is make quilts. So that's one thing people have done, but there are other things people can do.
Right, and I think that it was just kind of interesting after reading through your book, reading parts of your book. I thought, people have been doing this. We're not really reinventing anything. We're just
rediscovering it, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
If something has sentimental value in its form, it's sometimes hard to figure out, oh, what should I do with that? Because I want to keep it as my little girl's that she wore on the first day of school. I don't want to turn it into part of a quilt, but we have lots of cloth. We can decide how we want to treat these things.
Right.
All right, this book, obviously a watershed, if I can use that word, but certainly a tremendous educational endeavor for you. Where does this lead you? Is it to another book? Is it lectures? And folks, be sure and watch her videos. They're most enlightening. But what do you do with this now? You have a book?
Well, so I am doing a lot of lectures. I do lectures for fiber arts groups, mostly on Zoom so far because of the nature of things I'm doing. I have a few on my schedule for really after the first of the year that are in person, but I'm definitely doing lectures on the book and some of the ideas in the book. I made videos and I stopped making videos. I have some ideas of additional videos that I want to do. I continue to write on textile related topics. I recently wrote an article for Bloomberg Opinion about new techniques of indigo dyeing. And this is at the designed to be commercial scale that are working to make it a more environmentally benign process. And so it's an endlessly fascinating field. So I am working on that, and I'm sure eventually I will do some other book, but I like to put enough time between books to make sure that when I embark on another book project, it's something I really want to spend years working on. I don't do quickie books. I do books that take a couple of years at least to research and write. And then once you do a book, you spend your time talking to people like you for a while, talking about the book. So it needs to be something that you're really enthusiastic about. And then the other thing is, as I mentioned, I learned to weave as part of my process of research, and I got involved in the Southern California Hand Weavers Guild and have been their program co-chair for a while, including doing, booking, drawing on my far-flung network of contacts to do Zoom talks during COVID. And now we're gearing up to start meeting in person again and having workshops in person and having our Weaving and Fiber Festival in September and another one in May. So I'm very involved in that. It's not a writing project. It's just a wonderful group of many very talented artists. I'm not. I'm definitely still consider myself a newbie, but it's a wonderful thing to be involved in.
Spinning on the horizon?
I am not a good spinner. And I don't see spinning in my future. I did take some workshops. I have spun. I know what's involved, but I don't see spinning in my future. No.
There's people for
maybe
that.
Maybe more sewing. Though.
Okay. Yeah. Well, Virginia, this has been a treat. It's a terrific book, and I haven't even read it all. And really encourage people to get it. The Fabric of Civilization. Yes. You'll learn wonderful things, folks. Thanks so much. Thanks for doing the book, and thanks for sharing with us.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Keep up the good work. Take care.